everybody. Welcome to the School Community Huddle with Ana Martinez. Today we have two special guests directly from New Orleans. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organization and what you do.
You can go first.
I'm Larry Irvin. Thanks for having us, Anna, on the show as well. Larry Irvin, born and raised in New Orleans. I currently stand as CEO, co-founder of Brothers Empowered to Teach. We look to incentivize and inspire more men of color and women, but predominantly men, to become educators here locally, South Louisiana, but we will be expanding to about 10 cities over the next 5-6 years. But that's our basic premise, man. We're looking to put blackness in the classroom because we believe representation matters.
And I'm Christina. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Brothers Empowered to Teach.
How long has your organization been around, and what made you start it?
From a concept, you want to know? From a concept, it started in 2012, and it basically, we didn't. Our story is filled with serendipity and sort of just destiny, if you will, taking its course. Me and Christina met Mardi Gras 2011 randomly on a balcony at a local reggae club in the French Quarters. Started conversations around just my upbringing in New Orleans and sort of New Orleans post-Katrina, pre and post-Katrina, a lot of the changes that have been made, and I guess the ramifications, long-term, short-term, of gentrification and what that meant. And Christina brought a very East Coast lens, if you will, and vantage point to that conversation that initially, even though we were friends, initially caused us to, land on opposite sides of the spectrum in regards to the dialogue around gentrification in New Orleans and what is that looking like outside of the New Orleans lens, if you will. She brought a dearth of knowledge from community development and economic development, and that led to greater conversations just around gentrification and just where Black men fit into that equation, and just building with Christina and becoming friends, and her sort of having a chance to see up close some of these anecdotes and narratives that I shared with her as far as me growing up. She had a chance to see that up close as far as me losing friends, me burying friends, and the plight of Black men and what that looked like in New Orleans. And she met me at a time where I was definitely making my transition from that and trying to go in a different direction. We figured we had something, so we came back home, put our heads together, put our resources together, and figured we'll put our hand in a proverbial pile, if you will, to try to wane the narrative as far as Black men and representation of Black men. So there isn't a lot of times in these local communities, particularly in New Orleans, there isn't a lot of positive representation like there used to be decades ago. You don't have those elder figures, just giving a different light or a different perspective. There's a lot of negative, and Black men's have a very limited scope. Young Black men have a very limited scope as far as what's possible and the possibilities. And I like to phrase it as the big three, sports, entertainment, or the streets. There isn't much possibility outside of those. So we figured what better way could we sort of change the narrative with the place teachers in front of them and give them an opportunity to see success from a different vantage point.
I think when we tell this story, we certainly have different perspectives. I did move here from New York with, a bevy of experience in community development, up and down from Florida to Maine. I do think that one of the benefits of my experience in being in different places is, although I moved to New Orleans from New York with a lot of experience along the East Coast, I think what makes our partnership work and what particularly makes this work we do together work, because I get asked the question all the time, like, you co-founded an organization that's focused on Black men. Like, what's that about, right? Is that, the perspective I bring is that there are a lot of things that are common in community development, whether it's New Orleans or it's New York, right? And I think post-Katrina, for the thing that separates some of us from others is understanding, like, while that is true, you also have to be aware of the context in which that is functioning. And I think the thing that has made our partnership work with two people who are from different places, is that that context is important, right? And so you need someone who may have different experience and have been raised a different way, but understands, can see things in context. And I think that for me, the context is that, I grew up in a family full of Black men who were educators, right? And Black men who valued education and who spoke life into me as a young girl about the various things I could do, science, like I never as a child didn't believe I couldn't be president of the United States. Nobody ever told me that I couldn't, right? None of the men in my family ever said that. And my friends reflect the same values that the men that I grew up with reflect. And so from my perspective, my work is based on my grandfather and what he was able to do for so many Black men working as an educator in an urban school system in Cleveland. And so I think that, that's how I bought into the idea of sort of going along this pathway, right? Yeah, so there's that.
I love that you said that. It focuses on there is no single story for Black America, for the Black Americans. And I think people think that there is, and there isn't. And I think there's importance to highlight all the different the different stories and experiences. I'm wondering, what a great mission. Let's train, let's recruit, let's train, and place Black men in classrooms and in schools so that Black children can see themselves. And I hear the purpose of why. What challenges have you encountered? Like you recruit them, you train them, you place them in school. What are the challenges Black men are encountering in our schools? Or
how long do we have? There's a lot, man. I think one of the challenges, that's very blatant is the barriers and walls that come up when it's time for placement. So the placement of these young men. A lot of times what we've experienced is that, we recruit, we train, we condition, we expose them early on to working with kids, giving resources, preparation for what's the test? It's practice, for the practice and what have you. But when it comes to placement at a particular school, you see sort of arbitrary reasons why Black men may not fit, or they may not want a particular Black man. As we always say, Black men aren't a monolith, but a lot of times you see some of these school leaders sort of try to box Black men and put Black men in one box and expect a certain packaging or a certain level of polish for them all to have, not really necessarily noticing the greatness that each character, each individual brings to the door. If it doesn't look a certain way, and if it doesn't look like, if he isn't a 4.0 top of the class, very polished, articulate, well-spoken, basically a finished product from graduation, a lot of times there's a level of reticence and hesitation to bring those guys on because they just haven't taken the time to really learn the individual, and they're just assuming, based on those implicit biases, those stereotypes and things of that nature, right? That guy may not be a good fit, or he may not excel. That's the one big one that we see all the time. Chris, you want to add to that?
I mean, if you ask me, because racism, at the end of the day, these young men are just as unpolished as any other first-year teacher, right? They have the same class management challenges of am I extra hard or am I super friendly, but how do I get these children to not run me out of this classroom, right? We know that over time, men have historically, when it comes to thinking through the organization of what it requires to do lesson planning, et cetera, sometimes struggle more than our female teachers, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of times women, even when in leadership at school, et cetera, are put in the administrative position, right? So we already are used to having to do those kind of administrative tasky things. A lot of times men don't necessarily have the experience of, because in a team project, a lot of times women take on the administrative role, leadership role, which is because of sexism, right? So we don't recognize those things as well, right? And then the other thing is the arbitrary things we use to deny a Black man opportunity are the same arbitrary things we use as an excuse to give someone who's not Black an opportunity to lead a classroom, right? So we'll see our young men be in positions where they're hired as paraprofessionals, a school will lose a teacher in the middle of the year, and they will put that young person into a lead teacher role and keep them there for the year, right? And then instead of seeing the glows and growth of what they were able to accomplish over the year, even if they struggled, right? You still chose to put them in front of a bunch of children for a year, right? Instead of saying, oh, you did this right, and then we could help you with this, and this is how we're going to like support you and continue to be a lead teacher. It's like, no, go back to a para role. No, we're not going to pay you even though you have more experience because you didn't take the praxis. But we know that there are other teachers who have not yet taken the praxis who are making more money, right? So why not incentivize a young man to take a test, which he already feels like is biased against him being able to pass, right? So I think there's that, right? Then there's the other idea that, like, if you don't speak, walk, talk a certain way, that you cannot lead a classroom, that you're not intelligent, that you don't have the ability to impart knowledge to young people, right? When we know in communities across America where Black people live, whether it's Black middle-class communities or Black low-income class communities, or it's just at the family reunion, right? We all can speak both the job English and the community around the way family English. And that is a skill that sometimes you need to use to reach people where they are, right? But we instead want young people to rise to this place where they're basically displacing their culture to make other people feel comfortable with what works and what doesn't work.
And I think that just ties into sort of the Eurocentric way of how we've ascribed intelligence historically. You know, it hasn't deeply considered anyway other just other levels, other ways that intelligence culturally can be exuded from other ethnic groups, but particularly we're talking about Black men. Black men bring a level of culture sometimes, particularly the ones who come from, you know, those inner city urban environments. Those experiences and those skill sets are transferable if you allow them to be, if you notice them, if you see them as assets and not as liabilities. And that just speaks, you know, further to what Christina was saying.
And it's like using analogies in real life.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
I hear it's like Black exceptionalism. If you're not amazing, because most first-year teachers are not amazing. We're not great. And yet, how are all these teachers passing? But unless you're a Black and exceptional, you can't be in the classroom in your first year. We don't have the same thing. So instead of talking about how are we preparing these individuals for this school, I'm wondering about how can schools prepare for these individuals, right? So like, let's reverse it, because we're always talking about here's how minority groups or that are people of color
can conform to the system, right?
Let's talk about the opposite. Like, how are schools preparing themselves? How can we as schools prepare ourselves to be a place where we are creating a safe, inviting, equitable culture for our Black students and our Black educators?
Take it away. I'm on the slide over.
So, you know, sometimes Larry and I probably don't pat ourselves on the back enough, but back when we started dreaming up this thing, we always knew that it was cool that we were going to be able to recruit young men and convince them that education was something that is, being an educator is actually a revolutionary act, right? But we also asked ourselves long ago, are we asking Black men to put themselves into a poisoned well, right? We already know that equitable issues that teachers face and that students face and that their families face and continue to face, right? And so it's likely that the Black teacher, brown teacher will face similar things. And so we were like, well, if we do that, that's great. But how do we get these environments where they work to be better places, right? And so at first we tried to do the kicking of the tires of the schools where we go work. And, and some are really good at marketing and branding and, rolling out the dog and pony show when you first
right, when you walk through the building. Right.
And as we got a little more aged, we can, sort of separate the wheat from the shaft, right? And, we have a whole model by which we pick our school partners. But the reality is schools that function like that are very rare, right? Whether it's private or public, it's a rarity, right? And so it was like, well, we're going to probably have to help these schools do better. And so when we first started putting together the curriculum for the fellows and their personal and professional development, we work with Bank Street College, which designed this map for us that talks about basically changing attitudes at the beginning is the first step, changing practice at the end is the last step. And so I think the way how schools prepare themselves, start to ask themselves why, right? Why do you have this discipline policy for the children, right? Specifically, why? What are the problems that you've identified, and what are the outcomes that you want, and what do you get out of that, right? And has it improved? And if those are your goals, has it even improved what you wanted, or are you getting the exact opposite of what you asked for, right? Because a lot of times you are, right? Your suspension numbers going up, but are you getting more seat time? No. Are you getting better grades? No. Are you getting better engagement? No. Are you making parents feel like they're can trust you more with their child? No. Right? So like, start asking yourself why. Why is this a problem? Why do you keep having teachers leave? Right? You know what I mean? Like, do you have an exit survey? Like, why is this teacher leaving you? Is it because they're moving to Montana? Or they're deciding to be a stay-at-home mom? Or they're just like, you know what? I can't even deal with this anymore. I decided to leave, right? And start to think about, like, what are the ways in which you're reinforcing them making a choice to leave, right? Like, it really starts with the school asking themselves, you know, why do we have these challenges? And if we say we want Black educators, why aren't we able to get them? And being willing to listen and do some internal reflection on, like, how am I putting systems into place, right? The problem with that, though, is that schools often say, well, they just can't cut it with the way that we do things, right? Right? And so they're looking for a unicorn in great number that doesn't exist. Because as Black educators get more ensconced in the system, we've been dealing with racism since we were born, right? Like, we don't go to the store without thinking about racism. We don't walk out the front door without racism being in our mind, even if it's not conscious to us, right? So there's no way that we're going to walk in a classroom full of Black children and watch them be treated poorly, and when we bring it up, get treated poorly too, and not be like, because racism. So that's where it starts, right? And I think Black educators in those spaces who function well also need to ask themselves why you function well in this space, right? Knowing that these are sort of the complaints from parents and students about how this works. And I think that requires schools that are willing to do that push. And I just don't yet know. I think we have a higher number, and I think we can do this work through this thing that we're trying to do called Cypher 360 to help those schools that are kind of on a bubble. We're like, yeah, you know what? We really do have a problem. I'm a little afraid to do this, but let's see, right? And hopefully that will snowball into schools that are just, their feet are stuck in the stand and they just want Black versions of white people. I mean, white versions of Black people to be in their schools, because there aren't that many of us, really. So,
professional development is the way, Anna. We're going to approach it through professional development, but consistent, authentic, candid conversations sort of infused in this professional development for teachers, and the consistency is going to be the key. The consistency and the feedback is going to be the key. Christina don't want to brag, but that's the hard line answer. Cypher 360 is the answer. But sort of to put a bow on the big umbrella question, I don't think any initiative, any workshop, any PD will be effective unless institutions and systems really sit back and ask themselves to be introspective about what's going on, really looking at the numbers, really looking at retention numbers. Right now, locally, retention for teachers is 25% after the first year. Turnover, is 25%. It's double for Black teachers. It's 50%. But you have to really be introspective and be authentic in that conversation. Looking internally and saying, what are we doing as a system? What are we doing, as an institution, that these numbers keep occurring? You can't just keep blaming fresh new undergraduate educators who come into your building for your turnover. I'm sorry, you just can't.
And I just like to wrap that up with one thing. Like, when schools say folks can't hack it, right? When Black educators can't hack it, our data says the exact opposite, because we have these young people who go into schools in a tumultuous, decentralized system that's still trying to find its footing, right? And, here's an example. We had one school where we knew they were going to close at the end of the year, right? They were in the middle of the year. They had 50% of their teachers turnover. They were surviving strike, and they were fighting for their life as a school. There was chaos, right? And when we approached our fellows and said, listen, we don't want to put you, we know that you need to be challenged, and there will be challenges in systems, right? But this is a tenuous situation at best, and we may need to cut this partnership now. And they were like, no. These are undergraduate 19, 20-year-old students who were like, no, we are the stability right now. We are going to continue on our schedule. We will finish out this year. We will transition these children in the summertime, right? Like, these are 19 and 20-year-old people, so you cannot say that they're not ready for battle. What they're not going to do is continually be treated like crap every day, and watch children be treated like crap every day, and to decide to stay out of some sense of like Black people being able to take more pain than other people. You know what I mean? So that's my last thought.
Wow, that's so deep. I want to go into something you said earlier, Christina, and you, Larry. It's not just about, especially in the era of Black Lives Matter, and you see so many schools and teachers with Black Lives Matter, and now I want to teach Black Lives Matter, and now I want to do X, Y, and Z PD. Now I want to do this training and this book. But what I heard from you, Christina, is we got to live in the attitude part of your professional development, asking ourselves why. So almost like reflecting on our own mental models, not just non-Black, but also Black educators, reflecting on our own mental models. And to some extent, for, I would say, people of color that are educators, asking ourselves, how did we become so well adjusted? Where are our blind spots?
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. How long can school stay in the attitude and the why phase? Because I think we're in this hurry, this race to like get all this done, get racialized outcomes and get the best teachers and do this and do that. And like this urgency, but we don't want to spend like, me, Anna, let me really reflect on my mental models.
Right.
Black men, Black educators, Black culture. How did I get there? What is here to serve me and what's not serving me or the community well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I can't remember which civil rights speech this comes from, but they always say, how long, not long, right? And the not long is long, right? Because I think that the reality is this is a consistent and constant reflection as you work on being a better version of you, right? Like, for instance, I'm a meditator, right? I started meditating a couple years ago. I was consistent for a while, then I wasn't consistent. And I noticed the change in me when I became less consistent, right? And even though I had improved because I meditated all the time, there's still a decline in the amount of improvement because I don't continue. Meditation is a constant and permanent practice, right? This is the same thing with self-reflection. This is a constant and permanent practice, right? So all PD can do is give you the tools and then stay with you for a while to see how you implement them and adjust them as you go along to ensure it's something that works for you and your team and still gets to those results, right? But it can't be like Cypher 360 does, 240 hours of PD with you over a 2-year period. That's a random number, but let's just say we're doing that, right? And then we walk away and y'all go, okay, well, we did all that, and you go back to normal. No, because you're going to have new teachers who are going to have new perspective, and they too are going to need to understand the culture, and they're going to have to go through, some unlearning, right? Like, this is like undoing racism is unlearning for the rest of our lives for all of us in some ways, right? And so we have this rush to want to do everything on an election cycle, right? Everything's 4 years or 2 years. Like, oh, in 4 years, we're going to do this. In 10 years, we're going to do that, right?
Shorter.
And even shorter than and Ed, you know what I mean? Because, like, think about how quickly in school environments we're willing to change a principal, a lead teacher. Your head could spin from how frequently we're willing to change, rather than saying, okay, this is a long-term play. So let's evaluate this in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years, and see what we've done, how it's improved, what are the changes. But you're not going to see all of a sudden little Black kids who grew up in the hood with a bunch of teachers who didn't care about them, and 1 year we give them PD. They're not going to, next year, going to feel like those same teachers care about them. You know what I mean? Right?
Wow, that's so important. So what I'm hearing is none of us are arriving. We have to institute and create structures of reflection all the time, and these practices all the time.
Yes. If we want to do whole child, if we're saying if this new progression in education is about whole child development, right? Then it also has to be about whole person development for the educators who are in our building, who need the social emotional treatment and wellness. They need to build the practices by which they can, self-reflect. Like, that's just the only way. You can't be asking kids to do that stuff and we as adults don't, it doesn't work. It's an unbalance.
So then I would want to get your perspective in practical terms for an educator listening, or a teacher listening, or maybe a senior leader in an organization listening, or parents. So we have schools that are realizing these outcomes. Our Black boys are getting overrepresented in SPED. We're suspending them at high numbers, or our communities are at conflict with each other and they're using racialized slurs towards our Black students. Those are the outcomes. We're aware now. How would a school go about any one of those outcomes to really become a school that is in the attitudes phase of your professional development?
So, we proposed to do something for a local private school here that started off with sort of these internal focus conversations, right? With some self-reflective questions that we wanted to ask of parents, we wanted to ask of students who were new to the school, students who had been at the school for a while, for educators in the building, and sort of for community members who participated in activities at the school, right? And by having those conversations, you can then figure out what the common threads were, right? And then have a bigger conversation around that, right? I think you have to start there, and so one of the things we did on a charter school board that I was on was that we did a student survey, a parent survey, a teacher survey every year, right? We did it twice a year. And we asked some equity questions in that. And there are plenty, there's folks like Beloved Communities and others who have these surveys that you can do to be a starting place of, okay, this is where we are as leadership, right? And then I think you probably need to reach out to some external folks who have lots of experience. Not, there's all these folks who are entering the fray, right? But there are folks who've been doing it for a long time, right? Who don't necessarily, there are not necessarily that many folks in the practice lane, which is, I think, where we're going, like where our work in Cyber 360 sit, right? There are a lot of folks there are a good number of folks who are in the attitude lane, right? And you got to start with attitude. So maybe you start there and you engage someone like, People's Institute for Racial, I can't remember what it stands for, but People's Institute, it'll come up for racial justice. Or Overcoming Racism with Matthew Kincaid, who's a former, educator. And I think you start there, right? And you take the full thing. You don't take the little introduction 3-hour course and check it off the little PD list, right? You do the full thing, right? And the results of that come out, and then you can go on to, okay, now we know where we're at. And then we can then say, okay, well, who's going to help us with the practice part, right? And I think those two things combined get you there, right? But I just want to be clear, and Larry will probably re-emphasize this, but there's no shortcut, right? There is no shortcut. We have all been raised in a system of white supremacy. As one of my favorite pastors says, this is not only COVID-19, this is COVID-16-19, right? And so these are facts. And so, it's not going to be short term. We were born to think, all of us, that Black folks are inferior. Even Black people feel like Black people are inferior because we always say things like, we can't, we shouldn't, we won't, right? So we all have work to do, and it ain't short term. So I know we want to get back to business as usual, but now that the lid has been lifted and the steam has been let out, we can't put it back in.
And I'm thinking, as we're having this conversation, do we need to remove the in an attempt to make the conversation global and everybody sort of nobody really feel polarized, but we probably need a little bit of that. I was going to say, do we need to remove the dichotomy, like the whole Black and brown versus white dichotomy in these conversations, to make the conversation feel more more unified, if that makes sense. But then I'm asking myself at the same time, do we need to press on from a language standpoint, from an implementation standpoint? Do we really need to continue to press on, like, white supremacy and racism and pressing those terms and pressing those concepts.
Yes, because
continually
we consistently make white people comfortable. Right?
Right.
We always turn around and try to make them comfortable with whatever it is we're saying or doing. I think there's a balance between making folks uncomfortable and saying it to in a way that is compassionate and gracious, right? But it really does have to focus on, like, this is the system.
The reality
this is how the system affects all of us, not just you. This concept of whiteness affects you too. You know what I mean? Like, whiteness affects, like, there are folks who are being messed over, who are financially in a terrible position, who are making low wages, whose kids are also probably sitting outside Taco Bell trying to get Wi-Fi because they have virtual, right? But whiteness hides you, right? You want to hide because you don't want anybody to think you need a handout, right? So you're struggling in Appalachia or wherever else, right? Because whiteness says that this shouldn't be your situation, when the truth is economics say this is every working class person's situation in America, right? So I don't think we can sugarcoat it. I think we have to include also how white supremacy and the idea of whiteness affects white people in a very negative way. And I think maybe that is how you get to this question, because I get what you're saying.
I'm saying, how do we get them to stand in it?
Right.
Because a lot of times when you come with such a abrasive
sort
of approach, they don't want to stand in it. So it's like, you know.
And I think that the thing is not, I don't think you have to be abrasive about it, right? I think you have to be factual about it. Like, here's the, that's why Overcoming Racism and others like REI start with the data. They're like, just lay out the data, dude. Like, here's the data. If you're a numbers person, if you're a banker, let's just lay it out, right? It's not necessarily going to change your attitude, but it might start to make you think something else, right? I think you then have to turn around and say, how do you think white supremacy affects you, white person? It's not all good and gravy, right? And I don't think we have that conversation. You know what I mean?
So what I'm hearing is we all have to be, any school or school leader or educator needs to be willing to sit in the discomfort.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And questioning and asking themselves, how did I get so well adjusted? Where are my areas of growth?
Mm-hmm.
My areas where I'm well adjusted to this water that's so deep in all of us, right? Because what we're not saying is capitalism is another layer to all of this. And there also are Black families trying to get Wi-Fi, except we're not showing that publicly, because what we didn't see is social workers were sent to this particular family's house, and then they were displaced from their one bedroom that they were renting as a result of that picture going viral. And then you think of other Black families or other brown families that are like, see, that's why I don't say you need it, because the structure is actually not made to support. It's actually made to penalize and show that I'm the one doing wrong.
Right, exactly, right. It's not, I actually posted this today. I said something about the fact that, like, we, when you're a startup, right, you start with what the problem is. Here's the problem, right? And what do I want my outcomes to be from addressing that problem, right? Too frequently, we start from reaction. You know what I mean? Right? So, like, okay, rather than accepting the opportunity for us to try something different in education in a virtual environment and understanding the challenges about doing that with working parents, et cetera. So how do we bridge the two and make a school day that can work for a working parent who may be able to supervise you at home or may not, right? And also ensure there's some instructional time, right? So rather than accepting maybe there's some loss of instructional time, but there's some growth in independence, or they're like shortening, instead of mimicking the school day, right? We take the school day, we put it online and make kindergarten sit in front of you on Zoom for 8 hours. That doesn't work. Doesn't work for us as humans, as adults. It doesn't work, right? But rather than trying to think of that, we get so caught up in like just continuing the status quo, which already had equity problems that we didn't want to address. And this is just making them louder, right? And so, yeah, if we really want to get to a solution, then we have to make space for people to say, and we have to listen to them, because we don't listen, right? Like, middle-class parents have been saying the same thing about this, like, challenge of online, right? And how many devices need to be had, because, just because you're middle class doesn't mean you can afford 4 laptops or 3 iPads, or, or that you get to work from home, or one of you can work from home. Like, these are all same challenges, but we don't want to address the systems that make that happen, because it also says that we are failing in capitalism. right? Like that you and I as individuals are failing because we can't afford to do those things. And it pits parents against each other because you'll say, well, we'll have the parents to say, well, my child sits in front of their laptop for 8 hours a day with no problem, eats their snack at the snack time, and it's just fine, right? And it's like, no, it's not just fine. You just feel like if you're a rule follower, it looks good. And, you know, and so we need to make space for that kind of stuff. And we just don't.
I appreciate that. We're going to come to an end. So I'm wondering about your final advice for schools that want to do this work well. So there's a lot of schools that are signing up to do this work. And thank you for at least taking the first step. And how do we begin to do it well and do it right? What would be your advice for teachers or principals that are embarking on this work, or systems leaders?
Introspection, 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 and more introspection. Look at self, you know what I mean? From the top down, administration down, school leader down. Look at self, bring everybody into the conversation, bring everybody to the fold, down to janitors, coaches. It has to be a village conversation. It has to be. And I think that's what people start. It has to have that spirit, that foundation. Because if it's just about, like Christina alluded to earlier, if it's just about data and every decision being predicated on quick data turnaround, you're not going to get anywhere. You know what I mean? This is a constant process. It's cliche, but like respect the process, embrace the process, you know, of change, and, you know, think long term, look long term, think long term, have some level of patience. But introspection, man. It's time to be introspective and be authentic in that.
And my thing is, this is a system issue, right? This is not just an individual school, this is a systemic issue. And so I think not only from introspection, it has to come from leadership, right? So like, if one school in a district decides they're going to take the lead and do it that way in their school, then they have to be willing to advocate with the folks who are up above and below and around and next to that this work is important. And I think also internally to a school, you're going to get some resistance from teachers, right? They're not going to necessarily want to do this. They're going to feel like some teachers are going to feel like it's a waste of time, and why do I care? All I really care about is whether or not these scores go up, right? But you also have to make, while you have to make space for people to grow, you also have to say, if you're not willing to grow, this is really, really important to us culturally, right? And while the data that you get in your classroom is amazing, right? Like, I can't have you poisoning how students feel about themselves, right? And so therefore I have to make a decision also to change practices, even in the way I hire and retain educators. Even if it means I may potentially in the short run lose more teachers, right? That's how committed it requires us to be. If not, I mean, we can just keep doing it the way we're doing it, and, you know, the results will keep being what they are, and we'll keep losing students along the way, and having parents not trust educators, and educators choosing to just be like, I don't want to do this.
Yeah, it's gonna be ugly. You know, I think especially at the preliminary stages where we sort of are in right now. You're talking about uprooting culture that's been entrenched historically, right, in education, socially, in society, and that's gonna be that's gonna take a sturdy shovel, to get to the bottom and pull it all out, so we can plant that fresh seed. So, yeah.
That's so important. I think both have to be done at the same time, right? The work of self and the work of the system, because I am a product of the system and I've contributed to the system. And for me just to look outward would actually be a disservice to the community around me in particular. So I appreciate those two. And then I'm hearing the overall theme is you have to be comfortable with sitting in discomfort, with being uncomfortable, because parts of you that you thought were right or thought were the way to go were actually not serving others for so long. And you kind of became well adjusted, or you learned it in the path. And that's huge. And I think that's hard. That's going to bring up some cathartic feelings in a lot of people, because I'm going to feel guilt. I'm going to feel angry. I'm going to feel like, well, no, this is the way you're supposed to do it. Right. And so I think educators, if you're listening, the two pieces of the thing, yes, find your problem of practice, create your your plan of action, but have structures to reflect on self and reflect on the collective self of your team, right? Or else you're just gonna continue creating more outcomes, but you're not really gonna create transformational change. That's all for today, folks. This was a really, really great conversation. You gave us a gift, Christina and Larry. Educators, teachers, principals, remember, if you are learning one thing from today, then I did my job. You are enough, and we're doing this together. So let's create collective healing and collective transformation for the sake of our students in our country. Thank you all. Until next time.
Thank you, Anna.